Thank you everyone for coming. I hope everyone could hear me with my challenge of my vocal cords due to the I think change in weather and seasonal excitement. Today's topic, I'd like to thank Dr. Neil Abramson for encouraging me. It's a couple of months ago we had a medical ethics class, 2-tablet session, and we discussed some of these questions from a medical ethics perspective on calculating medical risk in Halacha. And Dr. Abramson said, wouldn't that be a great idea to transform it and tweak it a little bit and to make it into a Sunday morning shiur? So I tried to follow his advice, and we'll try to approach it as follows. So we're all familiar with the pasuk in the Torah, which charges us with the idea of "V'nishmartem ma'od l'nafsho seichem." We must guard our life very carefully. It's the most precious commodity we have, Baruch Hashem, our own lives, and we have to be very careful and vigilant to make sure we don't do things that are considered to be a sakana, considered to be danger. But of course, the question is, how do we define danger? You ask 3 people, you get at least 4 opinions of what danger is. What's considered a dangerous profession? What's considered a dangerous hobby? And we're going to try to discuss today, as best as we're able to, how we can view it through the prism of Halacha, how Halacha views danger, and what could we use for criteria to define danger in Halacha. So the first Marmak I'd like to start with on page 1, number 1, the tshuva of the Noda B'Yehuda. Many people are familiar with this tshuva for different parts of it. The shaila here was someone who inherited a large area of land, a large tract of land, probably acres and acres of land. Doesn't say exactly how large it was, but the idea was he now got this tremendous property, and he decided maybe he could take up a new hobby on his property. There were many forests and wildlife lived there, and he thought maybe now he could become a hunter. But being that he was a religious fellow, he was hesitant to think if this was hesitant to approach this as a kosher hobby. So he sent a shaila to the Noda B'Yehuda, or Becheskel Landau, one of the leading poskim of the generation, Gedolei Hadar, wanted to know if it is permissible for him to now go ahead and hunt on his property. So the Noda B'Yehuda right away at first responds with 2 potential problems, which those are the problems we're not going to focus on. But the first 2 potential problems he discusses is the Isser of Tsar Ba'al Chayim, the prohibition of causing pain and distress to animals. And the second shaila he discusses at length is Bal Tashchis, wasting. Is it considered to be wasteful and just, for no purpose, just to shoot a animal dead so you can end up with a nice bust on top of your fireplace? Those are the 2 main questions that Noda B'Yehuda deals with. But then towards the end of the tshuva, which we're going to discuss on, he raises another point. He says, I'm very bewildered by the fact that you thought this is permissible for another reason. He says, we all know the pasuk, V'nishmartem ma'od l'nafsho seichem. We have to be very careful to guard and protect our lives. And by walking into such a situation of a forest with a bow and arrow and thinking that you're going to take on these most ferocious beasts, he says you're putting yourself into a makom sakana. To put yourself into a makom sakana is an isser. You're violating this pasuk of that a person has to protect his life. So he says, forget about Tsar Ba'al Chayim, forget about what the animals might suffer if you're successful in hitting it. Forget about the fact that maybe it's Bal Tashchis. By putting yourself in this situation where you're attempting to hunt, you're putting yourself in a matzav, in a situation of sakana. And with that, Noda B'Yehuda goes through this idea, and he says, how do I know that hunting is a sakana? He says, it's a pasuk in the Torah. We see who is the main hunter in the Torah. We know Esav. Esav was the famous hunter in the Torah, and Esav tells Yaakov, why do I need the bechira? Why do I need the firstborn rights? My profession, I'm going to die anyway. Sometime, someplace in the forest, someone's going to hit me, or whatever it's going to be. I'm going to perish anyway, or the animals will get me. I'm going to die anyway as a hunter. So I don't need the bechira. And he goes ahead and sells it off to Yaakov. There's different ways how to understand the psukim, but Noda B'Yehuda is saying that's one way of understanding the psukim. So he says, you see clearly from the Torah that there's this idea that hunting is dangerous. So he says, how could it be that you're going to become a hunter and put yourself into such a situation of sakana? He says, unless you tell me that you need it for parnasa. He says, if you're poor and you have no other profession, and somehow you already know, I guess, that you'll be good at it, you're adept at hunting, this is a way that you could actually bring in some source of livelihood for your family. He says, if it's for parnasa, it's mutter. So of course the question begs, okay, just because you're going for parnasa, now you can put yourself into a makom of sakana, now you can put yourself at risk. How does one reason of parnasa allow you to put yourself in the situation of risk? So Noda B'Yehuda quotes a Gemara. And it's underlined a little bit in like the second paragraph over here. He says, I'll just paraphrase a little bit some of the words. He says, the Gemara says, Elav, the Gemara brings a pasuk. The pasuk at the end of Devarim says, Sefer Devarim, Elav hu noiseh es nafshay. The pasuk there is talking about the context of the pasuk is the obligation to pay workers on time. If a person has, as we know, if a person has someone working for him by daytime, you have to pay him before the sun sets. If it works for you by night, you have to pay him before the sun rises. And the pasuk says it's emphasizing the importance of paying someone on time because the love to the wages, who noiseh es nafshay, he's literally putting his life on the line. And from there the Gemara explains why else would a person climb trees and go up on high ramps or put himself in dangerous situations if not for the fact that he needs a parnasa. So by you withholding his wages, you're really causing him much distress. He put himself out on the line literally for you to go do whatever job you needed, and now you're withholding his wages. That's not fair. And therefore we have the mitzvah of paying workers on time. But says the Night of Yehuda, but you see from the wording of the Gemara, the way the Gemara sets up the context, that a person, ve'elav hu noiseh es nafsho, in it, he's kind of putting his life in balance. So you see that the Gemara self-understood that a person's allowed to put himself at a certain level of risk for getting his parnasa, to earn his livelihood. Now, here we are in 2016, and we're very advanced mathematically, and we want to have everything exactly to a formula, so what the percentage is. How much risk was it the Gemara was referring to? Well, for whatever reason, maybe we can figure it out as we go along. The Gemara doesn't quantify it in specific ratio with a percentage of what that level of risk is. So we're going to make it a gray area now. There's a certain level of risk that the Night of Yehuda says he brings a Gemara that a person is allowed to put himself in for the reason of parnasa, to earn a livelihood. But again, the Night of Yehuda emphasizes that if it's not for livelihood, then you have no right to put yourself into such a situation. And therefore he says, if you don't need it for your parnasa, which seemingly from the context of this person didn't need it for his parnasa, he just wanted to do it for a hobby, the Night of Yehuda said it should be prohibited, it will be usher for you to put yourself into such a situation. That's the tshuva of Night of Yehuda. On the next page, I just copied over the Gemara in number 2, where it's interesting because this is the Gemara Night of Yehuda is quoting. It's a very short piece of Gemara. And the Gemara really just says, like I spoke out before, I could just read it inside where it's bracketed off. The Gemara is in the middle of a discussion. It says, look at the Tanya, we need it for the following brisa, which says, the Gemara is quoting the pasuk, ve'elav hu noiseh es nafsho, for what purpose does this person go up on a ramp, v'nitla be'ilan, or hang himself off a tree, some type of tree cutting business, and literally gives himself up for death, on the brink of death, to earn his livelihood. Lo yal is not for the fact that he should get his wages. Therefore, it's incumbent upon us to make sure we pay the workers on time. Now, it's interesting to keep in mind that although the Gemara says that it's just like a middle of a discussion there, I'm just kind of isolating the phrase of the Gemara there. The Gemara is in the middle of a larger discussion. The Rishonim, the Poskim, the Rambam, the Shulchan Aruch never quote this idea la halacha. You will not find codified in the Rambam the line that says a person is allowed to put himself in sakana for parnasa, or the Shulchan Aruch doesn't bring such halacha. The Rishonim don't. It's not brought la halacha. Now, the Night of Yehuda though felt that the Stam Gemara, just the plain reading of the Gemara, is enough that to teach us this idea. But it's just interesting to point out to the Rishonim, they don't argue with it. The Rishonim, there's nothing specific in the Rishonim that says you're not allowed to do it per se, but it's interesting that the Rishonim themselves, the main codifiers of halacha, don't quote this as a bottom line psak that you're allowed to do this. However, although the Night of Yehuda wasn't coming from any specific Rishonim, he does have a good friend, someone else who learned the Gemara just like him, and that's Rav Moshe Feinstein. Rav Moshe Feinstein in the Tshuva addressing a completely different question in number 3. Rav Moshe was asked a question, it's a little bit vague exactly what the context was, but we'll try to explain it the way we're able to relate to it. Rav Moshe was asked, is it permissible for a person to play in professional sports? Now, I'm assuming he wasn't talking about tennis or golf or baseball, where the level of sakana is probably very close to nothing. I'm not exactly putting the ratio there, but there's very low percentage of sakana when you're playing America's favorite pastime. I'm assuming he's talking about something like ice hockey or tackle football, where there's a lot of aggression, there's a lot of fists flying, physical contact, people banging into each other in a really hard way. And let's assume he's talking about that. And he was asked, is it permissible for a Jew to put himself in that situation? He's only addressing it from a halachic standpoint of a sakana. I would think there's a myriad of questions that will have to come up if a Jew wants to play professional sports from a Torah standpoint. But he's only addressing one area of it, is is it considered to be putting yourself into a makam sakana? Is it considered to be putting yourself into a situation of danger, which would be prohibited by the Torah, like the pasuk of "V'nishmartem ol nafsho seichem"? So Moshe Feinstein says, from the way he understands what he calls ball, Beis, Aleph, Lamed, Belaz, the way you play ball, he says, although there is a certain level of risk involved, he says that's 1 in thousands. It's a very slight, very small, less than 1% chance of danger involved. I'm making an assumption, he's also probably talking about if you're wearing the proper equipment, the proper shoulder pads, the body protection, a proper suitable helmet. There you have much less percent of a chance, 1 in thousands, Moshe says, of coming to any situation of a sakana of danger. He says, not only that, but it's not only a problem of putting your own life in danger. Perhaps you shouldn't be able to play the sport because you're putting someone else's life in danger. You're the lineman and you're rushing into somebody. You potentially are going to bowl him over and maybe give him a concussion, God forbid, or knock him out or something like that. But says Moshe, everybody playing the sport is putting themselves in that situation. They're agreeing to it, and the chance of it coming to a sakana, the way he understands it, is he says less than 1 in thousands. He doesn't quantify a specific number, but he says it's very low risk. And he says, I have a Gemara in Bab Metzia, Kuf Yud Beis, the same Gemara that Rabbi Yehuda quotes, which says that for Parnasa, which is the question the person was asking here, he wants to do it for a profession. For Parnasa, Moshe says for Parnasa it's mutter. And Moshe concludes the tshuva that he found the same idea in the Noda B'Yehuda, which one we quoted before, and he's happy that he is in good company with the Noda B'Yehuda. So again, we now have Moshe Feinstein and the Noda B'Yehuda, two of our great poskim, who are very clearly pasking for us that for a parnasa purpose, for reasons of earning a livelihood, a person is allowed to put himself into a certain percentage of a sakana. Again, the way Moshe Feinstein calls it, he says 1 in thousands, which is less than 1%. It doesn't say what it will be, but obviously very, very nil percent of risk involved. And according to Noda B'Yehuda, it doesn't give any quantify of any numbers. He just says, going hunting, although it's a sakana, we can allow you if it's for a parnasa. Okay, so we have these two great poskim saying this similar idea.
Just a question about the danger. It's danger of life or danger of some sort of impairment?
Excellent. Okay, so I want to discuss that more shortly, but let's assume now we're discussing not only danger of life, but in general sense, the pasuk, V'nishmartem ol nafsho seichem, I don't know if you have to say that's only talking about, life or death, even putting yourself in a situation where, God forbid, you'll suffer a concussion, or you'll lose a limb, or anything like that. I would think also that's not allowed, because Hashem gave us our bodies to function the way we have it. We're not supposed to, put ourselves in a situation where we might lose a leg, chas v'shalom, or an arm, or a finger, or anything of that nature. But that's my own assessment, my own assumption. But we'll see shortly when we get to a case of bris milah, perhaps later, that might make a distinction. So, just to make this shaila maybe a little more relevant to us, because most of us, I think, are not actively pursuing a career in professional sports, and probably not pursuing a career in professional hunting, Rabbi Yitzchak Zilberstein was asked the following shaila. Unfortunately, today in Eretz Yisrael, there are many roads which are dangerous to drive on. They're near the Arab neighborhoods, whether they're on the green line, past the green line, over the green line, or even sometimes in Yerushalayim, many of the roads there, people say they're dangerous. There have been, unfortunately, incidents where people have been attacked and killed on the road, Rahman al-Itzlan. So he was asked by a Rebbe, a Magid Shiur, who was asked to come give a shiur in one of these places, in one of the shtachim, in one of the settlements, where it was, people, say it's dangerous to go there, and there's been incidents on the road in the past, but they're offering to pay him. This is his parnasa. He's a Magid Shiur. He gives the daf yomi shiur, whatever it is, some type of shiur. And they called him from this settlement if he can please come give a shiur, because they heard he gives great talks. Could he please come and deliver a shiur in their community? And he wasn't sure, is he allowed to go or not? This is his parnasa. He's a Magid Shiur, but at the same time, there's a certain level of risk riding on these roads, whether or not is he allowed to go there to deliver the shiur or not. So let's discuss some more Mar Mekaymes before we come back and try to explain this in our contemporary terms. The next Mar Mekayim is a fascinating shaila in number 4, which is a quote from the Pischei Tshuva, which is on the Shulchan Aruch. It's on the bottom of the Shulchan Aruch. And he quotes there from a tshuva of the Me'il Tzedakah. The Me'il Tzedakah, one of the great poskim, his name was Rav Yoina Lansdorfer. Unfortunately, he was nifter very young at 34, and he lived in the late 1600s, early 1700s. He was the contemporary of the Chacham Tzvi. He was a great-grandson of the Moralmi Prague. He had great lineage. He had great contemporaries, but unfortunately, tragically, he had a short life. but he left over a response which he actually published in his lifetime already called Me'il Tzedakah. And there the Me'il Tzedakah was asked the following shaila. There were 3 families from a different town, not where he lived, but they were writing him this shaila. These 3 families had decided that they were going to move to Eretz Yisrael. Keep in mind, this is the late 1600s, early 1700s. Things were very different than they were today. And they said that these 3 families, they were men, with their wives, and their young children. The children were young, 2, 3-year-old children, very young children. And when they announced in their town that these 3 families, they made an announcement, a Kiddush and Shul one week, we're all making Aliyah, we're all moving to Eretz Yisrael. So the local Bezdin in their town paskin that they're not allowed to go. The exact details are not clear exactly how they did it, whether they approached the Bezdin or the Bezdin just put a proclamation out against them, they can't go. Why? The Bezdin says because you're putting your young children in a sakana, traveling on the roads from Europe in those days, whatever country exactly they were coming from, somewhere in Poland, Hungary area, to go to Eretz Yisrael. That long journey is a sakana for young children, and the Bezdin said, we forbid you for going to Eretz Yisrael to travel with your families because you're putting your families at risk. And therefore it's usher to go. And these families, understandably, were very distraught. Here they had their lifelong dream of moving to Eretz Yisrael, and the Bezdin is telling them not allowed to go. So they write to them, Me'il Tzedakah, could you please help us out over here? Could you tell us, what's the halacha? Are we allowed to go to Eretz Yisrael, or do we have to listen to our local Bezdin, and we'll have to stay here in Europe because the traveling itself is a sakana? So at first the Me'il Tzedakah deals with the discussion, which is a shiur on itself. Is the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael B'zman Hazeh still applicable in full force, or do we not have that mitzvah to the full extent today or not? That's a shaila on itself, and the way it's quoted over here in shorthand is that he's of the opinion that there is still, yes, an active mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael B'zman Hazeh. And he says, however, there are shitos in the Rishonim, Tosfos, in Ksubis, which says that there is no mitzvah b'zman hazeh, and that's a question if Tosfos really meant it or didn't mean it. Be that as it may, Tosfos says there's another reason why you can't go to Eretz Yisrael. Tosfos says because b'zman hazeh there's sakanas drachim, and these are times of Tosfos. Tosfos is the 11, 10, 1200s, or couple of hundred years earlier, and Tosfos already lays down this idea that there's a sakana in traveling from Europe and France, wherever all the various Balei Tosfos were, to Eretz Yisrael in those days, and Tosfos said we shouldn't do it because there is a sakana on the way. Now, says the Me'il Tzedakah, it's hard for him to accept that. He says, first of all, of course, that's going to depend on every tkufa, every time period in history. We'll have to evaluate: is there a sakana or not a sakana? You can't tell me because there was sakana 500 years ago. There's still a sakana, a danger today. You got to check into it. You can't, these things change every couple of years. It's not something you could just take a statistic from 500 years ago and just plug it into today. Furthermore, he says, even Mizman Beis HaMikdash, it was dangerous to travel on the roads often. There are stories we have in Midrash when people were attacked on the road, all types of things. There's always in a certain level of risk when you get onto a highway or a mudway, whatever they had in those days, to travel down to Eretz Yisrael. And nonetheless, people made Aliyah, people were Ola Regel that came to the Beis HaMikdash, whatever the case is, people always travel to Eretz Yisrael even with a certain level of risk. Furthermore, he says, is that there's no reason to say that there's more sakana for children than there is for anybody else. He says children by nature are much easier, they bounce back much easier, even if they get seasick or they have some type of disease or something happens to them along the way, they usually bounce back much quicker than adults, and if it's not dangerous for the adults, it's not dangerous for children, they'll be okay. And then he says something very interesting. He quotes from the Mabit. Mabit was from the Tkufa of the Beis Yosef, about 200-300 years before the Me'il Tzedakah, and the Mabit writes that how do we evaluate what's a sakana to travel or not? He says, look at the merchants. If the merchants are doing business as usual, so even though there might be a certain level of risk, but if the merchants are doing it, then we can go as well. Even though it's true, there's pirates, there's bandits along the road, whatever there might be various dangers, there are potholes or animals, whatever the dangers might be along the way. If business is as usual, then you can go to Eretz Yisrael as well. So he says, look around. We see today, in those days, there were people who were traveling by sea. However, they got around through the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, whatever it was, how they got around, they traveled to do business as usual. He says, therefore, I allow you to go to Eretz Yisrael. You don't have to worry about the psak of your local bezdin. He says it's similar to a case of a bezdin that paskins that the sun has set. And you walk outside, you see it's sunny outside. So it's clear as day that they made a mistake. he says, I allow you, in my opinion, this says the Milt Staka, you're allowed to go to Eretz Yisrael, you shall have Hatzlacha on a safe trip. But, here's the catch. He says, of course, there's always one catch at the end. You can go, I don't think there's a sakana today in the roads because of the business. Business is as usual, so you can travel. But there's another sakana you forgot to take into consideration. He says, what's your plan when you get to Eretz Yisrael? Do you have a makom parnasa? Do you have a way to support your family? Or are you just going and you're going to kind of wing it and hope that you find something, or you'll rely on the communal funds or something of that nature? He says that is much more of a risk. He says if you're going to go to Eretz Yisrael without any idea of how you're going to earn yourself a livelihood, then I forbid you to go. That's not a way to do it. If you have a strong source of parnasa here, and that will not adequately provide for your family in the land of Israel, then you're not allowed to go. He says that's putting your children at a greater risk. Children cannot live a chayei tsar. They can't live a depressed and distressed and a hard life. If you're going to put yourself into a situation of poverty in Eretz Yisrael, worse than you have it here, so your children are going to go to Tarbus Ra, he says. They're going to go off the path. And that's much worse of a sakana, he says, than traveling on the roads. And therefore, he says, if you don't have a proper source of parnasa, I forbid you from traveling. And that's the end of the tshuva. So it's very fascinating, where he kind of took a little turn over here, a turn of events, where he was asked about the sakana on derachim, about the sakana of traveling. He says, no, that I can put away because we see people are doing business. And that's a good formula we're going to use in a moment. But the sakana of not providing for your family, he says, that's much worse in my eyes, and that's much more detrimental for your family than some problems along the road. And therefore, he told these people, if you don't have a source of parnasa, don't travel. What's interesting, I want to add on, is that the Meshech Chochmah in Parshas Lech Lecha quotes a fascinating Zohar. The Zohar says in the beginning of Lech Lecha that Hashem said, and then the pasuk says on the pasuk in front of you, by Vayika, Abraham had to take Sarah. So the Zohar Darshan, what does it mean he took Sarah? He had to talk her into it. He had to take her with words. He had to kind of schmooze her out and convince her that it's appropriate for them to go to Eretz Yisrael. Says the Zohar, why? Why didn't you just say, okay, Hashem told me it's time to go to the land of Israel, let's pack our bags and go? Says the Zohar, because it's forbidden for a man to move his wife to a different country without her consent. And therefore, Avram had to convince her. Asked the Meshech Chochmah and many other Mefarshim as well, that's very bothersome. There's a Gemara Mefureshes and a Shulchan Aruch, we paskin that it's true that a husband cannot force his wife to take her to another country without her consent, and therefore you have to talk her into it. But to Eretz Yisrael, the halacha is that you could say one day, honey, we're going, that's it, it's time to pack our bags, we're making aliyah. And it's too bad on her. That's it. Eretz Yisrael is a mitzvah, and you can tell her we're making aliyah. Now, as long as you fulfill other conditions, like the Milt Staka said, the parnasa, etc. But other factors aside, just the idea of going to Eretz Yisrael, a husband is allowed to force his wife. And if she refuses to go, the halacha is it's grounds for divorce. So ask the Meshech Chochmah and other Mefarshim, what's pshat? Why does the Zohar say that Avram had to convince her to go to a foreign land? Eretz Yisrael is a mitzvah in itself. And there are various tirutzim to this kasha, but I wanted to share with you the answer of the Magen Avram. Magen Avram we're familiar with for his commentary on Shulchan Aruch as being a posek, but he has other svarim as well. And one of his other svarim is called Shem and Sason. It's like, like the song we'll sing on Lag BaOmer, Shem and Sasan Mechaverecha, and that, as you might guess, Shem and Sasan is a pirush on the Zohar. Besides being a great halachic mind, the Magen Avram is also a Kabbalist, and the Magen Avram writes on his pirush in the Zohar and Shem and Sasan, the reason why Avram Avinu had to convince Sarah to go to Eretz Yisrael, because what does the pasuk say about Eretz Canaan on that day? Va'kanani az ba'aretz. The Canaanim lived there at the time, and the Canaanim were a very strong, powerful nation, and it was dangerous. He's putting himself and his wife at a risk of being attacked by these foreign nation that might be very hostile to them coming into their land. So it was a sakana for Avram Avinu to go to Eretz Yisrael. So Hashem told him he should go, but he has to convince Sarah to go because Sarah can say, "Listen, for me it's a sakana. I don't have to go. Hashem told you to go. Okay, you can go, but me, I don't want to put myself in a sakana." So the Magen Avram says that's why Avram had to work so hard to convince her, because sakana would have been enough of a reason to excuse them from going to Eretz Yisrael. So just keep in mind that's obviously not working exactly with the lumdus of the Milt Staka, but it's not a stira to him, because the Milt Stucco was saying that in his day, you see, the business was as usual, and therefore he allowed them to go to Eretz Yisrael and not travel on the roads. But it's interesting to note that, according to the Magen Avraham, that was a valid reason why Sarah theoretically did not necessarily have to go to Eretz Yisrael. Okay, so we have this idea that the Milt Stucco, this is how the Poskim deal with it extensively, they give us this idea that if you're going for Parnasa, then again, like similar to Noid Yehuda, although Noid Yehuda didn't quote this, and Moshe Feinstein didn't quote this, but it's a similar idea that for Parnasa, we kind of look the other way. We see how that kind of helps us gauge what's a sakana. So if they could do it for, let's just restate that. The Noid Yehuda said that Parnasa is a reason that you can put yourself in a certain level of sakana. What the Milt Stucco is doing is kind of adjusting it a little bit and saying that Parnasa is a reason allowed to put yourself into a certain level of sakana. But now when there's another pushing reason for you to do it, a mitzvah reason, Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, that's similar to Parnasa to the extent that, let's say I wanted to go to Eretz Yisrael or some other place. Let's say I want to travel to Zimbabwe for fun. Now, I don't know anything statistically about Zimbabwe today. I don't know. I don't want to get political. I don't really know anything about it. But let's assume for a moment that it's dangerous. And I'm going just for fun. I want to tour the land. So then it could be, it'll be usher for me to go because I'm putting myself in a Mokum Sakana, assuming that it's dangerous there. But if I had a certain trade and Zimbabwe was the place where I had to go to do my Parnasa, then according to Noid Yehuda, I'm allowed to put myself up to a certain level of Sakana and to go travel that place. The way the Milt Stucco is extending it is saying that if we see people going there for Parnasa, so we allow you to also do it for other pressing reasons, i.e. mitzvahs Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. Doesn't necessarily give me a blanket heter that I can now go ahead and go there for fun. I'm assuming he would still agree to the idea of the Noid Yehuda that if I'm just doing it for a sport, then there's a reason that I should refrain from doing it because there is some level of risk still involved. Let's move on to the next shaila now, and see here we're going to have a little twist. We're actually going to get to some type of statistic. And number 5 is a tshuva from the Imre Eish. The Imre Eish was Rameir Eisenstadt. He was a Rav in Ungvar in Hungary in the late 1800s. And he was asked the following depressing shaila. Unfortunately, in Poland and Hungary at that time, they were often at war, these countries, whether with themselves or with other neighboring countries. And there was a mandatory draft. They had to get a certain amount of people from every shtetl to join the army. They needed people. They needed young men in the army. So what would happen is that the town would get together and say, listen, we have to put 5 young men up to the army. We're offering from the town's fund, any family that wants to, or any person who wants to put himself out in the army, we'll give you X amount of dollars. Whatever, we'll give you $100,000 if you go to the army from the town communal funds. And 5 people who needed the money, or the families needing the money, would go ahead and offer themselves to go to the army, and their families would get this nice deposit of cash. So it was a depressing situation, but the Imre Eish was asked, is it mutter or not? Is a person allowed to put himself in that situation for money? The family or the person himself obviously needed the money. They weren't being forced to do this. They were looking for volunteers for a certain amount of money to do it. Were you allowed to put yourself into the risk of joining the army? Now, of course, joining the army during wartime, we know there's a certain level of risk that you might not come back. Or you might not come back in one piece. You might come back maimed or severely injured, or unfortunately might come back in a box. So are you allowed to do this or not? And Imre Eish just cut out part of the tshuva. He says, it's interesting, he says, we find by David HaMelech, we find in Tanakh, and the Gemara discussed it, that David HaMelech went out often for what's called Mechemes Rishus. And there's a whole shaila, how do we define what's called a Mechemes Rishus, a war of Rishus, and a Mechemes Mitzvah, a war of a Mitzvah. But for now, we'll understand that a Mechemes Rishus is when they were going out just to expand the borders of Eretz Yisrael, and they needed more land for the people. Excuse me. So he says, we find often that David HaMelech went forth from Mechemes Rishus. He went forth for these wars which were not mandatory, were not mandated that you needed to do it. And we never find David HaMelech was punished for it. He was allowed to do it. Now there's always an inherent risk of going to war. People might get lost at battle. And he quotes, where underlined there in parentheses, he says, I'll back myself up. He says, look, ayin b'soif shavuos ha'edus. Look at the Gemara, he says, at the end of Shavuos, edus u'b'tois v'sham. We'll get to that Gemara in a moment, but very backhandedly, he quotes a Gemara without telling you much about what's going on over there. He says, that's a proof that you could put yourself at a certain risk for war. And then he says, further, he says, Also in the times of the Chashmonaim, where there were many malachim during the second Beis Hamikdash from the Chashmonai descent that were ksherim, and they also went out often for milchamos of just rivach, of just expanding the borders of Eretz Yisrael. And he says also that'll be permissible. And he doesn't really give the background, he quotes you a Gemara in Gittin, which on the bottom of the second paragraph, it's not underlined. He says, look over there in the Taisvis, where you see Reish Lakish was not mezalzel in himself. So let's now go through these two cryptic rayas of the Imrei Eish and try to understand exactly what he's talking about. So on the next page, in number 6, we go to that Gemara at the end of Shavuos Edus, the Gemara at the end of Perak and Shavuos, Taf Lamed Hey Amid Beis. I just copied out one line of that Gemara with Taisvis there. The Gemara there says, the Omar Shmuel, I'm just isolating a phrase from the Gemara there, Shmuel says, Malchusa, the Katla Chad Bishisa, a kingdom which kills a sixth of its inhabitants, up to a sixth of its inhabitants, Lo Mi'anchi does not get punished. So the Gemara here is saying, the way Taisus explains the Gemara, that when a country goes out to war, a Jewish king sends his army out to war, there's a self-understood risk of up to 1/6, 16% approximately, of people that might not make it back. He says that's okay. Up to 16% approximately, 1/6, he says, is accepted risk that you can take, that a king's allowed to take. He won't be held responsible if he loses a sixth of his soldiers. More than that, then the king will get punished. So from here, this is where the Imrei Eish is coming. You see, David HaMelech was allowed, the armies were allowed to take a risk of up to 1/6, and that was not considered bloodshed. That's a pretty high percentage. 17% of people going are not going to come back. Out of every 100 people that went, right, only 83 or 84 of them came back. That's a large block of people that unfortunately have a risk of losing their lives, and nonetheless, he says, you see from this Gemara, that risk is acceptable for a king to take. That's raya number 1. We'll discuss that raya more in a moment. Raya number 2, he says, is very interesting. That's the Gemara in Gittin number 7 on Daf Mem Zayin. The Gemara there is discussing people who called themselves the Ludai. The Ludai was a group of people, non-Jews, who they feasted on other people, right? They ate humans. That's what's it called? Cannibals, right? Cannibals, and they were a little bit, problematic. People were very scared to go near where they lived because they never knew if you might end up to be their supper. And Reish Lakish, who was a strong man, wanted to teach these people a lesson. He wanted to get rid of them once and for all. So what did he do? The Gemara recounts as follows. It's in the bracketed off area. I'll read it through because it's really a fascinating story. Reish Lakish went, Zavin Nafshe, he sold himself to Ludai. So he sold himself, he went over to them, he came up to their colony and said, look at me, would you like to feast on me for dinner tonight? Pay my family off, whatever it was, $500, whatever it is, take me in. And they said, sure, we'll take you, no problem. They pay him off, and they invite him in for dinner. However, these... To
eat there or to be the dinner?
Well, Reish Lakish was going to be the dinner. That's what he sold himself for. But he knows, Reish Lakish knows that these people, although they're a little bit twisted up there, but they're very religious in the fact that they always grant you your last wish. And that's the respectful thing they always do. The Gemara discusses it. They felt that that's the way, if they always grant the last wish, the people will forgive them. And they won't forever hold them accountable for what they did to them. So Reish Lakish says, listen, he brought in with him a little like a light bag. I don't know, we'll call it a brown paper bag, so to speak. He brings in with him this light bag with a weight inside, but the weight was undiscernible. You couldn't tell that in this bag was a heavy weight. So he carries his bag in with him, and he says, I'm here to be your dinner, fine. And they say, okay, great, and they advertise tonight's dinner. Everyone come join us for Reish Lakish on the fire, right? And they say, okay, it's 5 o'clock Sunday afternoon. Reish Lakish, what's your last request? And he says, well, my last request is that everyone should sit there on their seats, and I'm going to tie you up, and I'm going to hit you 1.5 times. They say, okay, obviously they're a little nervous about it probably, but they're very steadfast in this is their religious custom. They always grant the last request. Say, okay, well, follow your orders. So they all sit down in their chairs. Reish Lakish ties him up and says, okay, I'm going to hit you with my bag 1.5 times. Reish Lakish, as we said, was quite a large fellow, quite a strong fellow. He takes his bag and strikes all of them one time, and they all, basically, the Gemara says, they were nafik nishmase. They're on the brink now of death. They're all kind of semi-unconscious. And he says, oh, you guys are still smiling. I still owe you another half a hit. And he goes and knocks them all dead, and that's the end of the Ludai. That's the end of this Gemara. Very fascinating Gemara, very interesting, and there's a lot of discussion we can have about this story. But we're going to focus on one slight diak on Taisus. Taisus says on the top of the page over there, where there's an arrow and it's underlined. Taisus says, "Reish Lakish zavin nafshei ludoi." Says Taisus, "Kaidem shechazal mutav." This is Reish Lakish before he was chazal the tshuva. We know Reish Lakish had an interesting story how he met up with Rabbi Yechanan, and Rabbi Yechanan brought him in to be his Talmud, and eventually he became the great Reish Lakish. But before then, Reish Lakish was the head of the bandits. Says Taisus, this is the old Reish Lakish. This is Reish Lakish before he was chayzer b'tshuva. How do I know? Says Taisus, Demistama, because we can assume if he was already chayzer b'tshuva, he would not degrade himself in such a fashion and go and put himself in such a situation. Now,
from the sakana aspect,
from the one second. Taisus says he wouldn't mizalzel himself. He wouldn't degrade himself. Degrade himself? I mean, this is the Imre Yesh's raya. He says, "What do you mean degrade yourself? You're putting yourself in malkum sakana." How can Reish Lakish do this? Why does Taisus use the wording? The wording and the nuance of the word is very important. Reish Lakish will not be mizalzel on himself. Taisus should have said Reish Lakish would never have put himself into a sakana, into a situation of a risk. Because if you be a frum yid, you never put yourself into such a risk. Why does Taisus say that Reish Lakish was not going to be mizalzel himself and not degrade himself? From here says the Imre Eish, you see, from the careful wording of Taisus, that it wasn't a sakana for Reish Lakish. Since he was such a strong man, and he was so confident, and he knew his abilities, I guess from his previous experiences, that he can take care of these guys once and for all, for him it wouldn't be a sakana. For other people, for me, maybe for you, some of you, it would have been a sakana. But for Reish Lakish, it wasn't a sakana, it was only a shaila of zilzal, of degradation. And therefore, it must be before he was frum. Because after he was frum and he was a great Reish Lakish, he would never lower himself to do such a demeaning act. So says, concludes the Imre Eish, from these two riots, from David HaMelech going out to battle and allowing a risk of up to 16-17%, and from this idea of Reish Lakish, which is not quantified by a number, but you see that putting yourself in a situation where you're confident that you can come back, you're confident in your strength, he says, therefore, the Imre Eish says, I allow this unfortunate custom to continue, that in towns where they have a need to pay off people to go to the army, there's no isser in it. Of course, he's not promoting it as this is what should be done, but he's saying it will not be us, as the Imre Eish said, from a halachic standpoint of sakana. Yeah.
Where in the calculation do you have not only a calculation of going to the cannibals or going off to war versus the danger of not doing something? You don't send 5 students as the king of the comment.
Oh, I mean, what's going to happen if the town? Okay, I'm not sure.
Or is everybody else going to get eaten up by these cannibals if we don't?
Well, these people were dangerous. The case of the Gemara of the cannibals, they were dangerous. They were causing harm to society at large. Reish Lakish wanted to put a stop to it. In the first case, right, that is an element, right. In the first case of the army with the war, it wasn't clear to me exactly what level of risk there was. There was a certain quota. The flip side of it, of what would happen if it wasn't fulfilled. I don't know if there would be a tremendous fine, or if everyone would be put in jail, or there would be attacked. I'm not sure. It's not clear, but there was some level of risk. Yeah.
That also goes to the risk. That fact goes into the risk assessment with the soldiers.
Right.
What are the, not just the fact of the possibility of going off to the army and when a person comes back, but the fact that what are the other, if we don't have these fights.
Right. Okay, I just want to, let's just figure out, because I didn't realize we're almost out of time. I'll come back to you afterwards. Let's finish up. However, this raya, this proof Imre Eish brings from the war, does not go down without a debate. Rabbi Yitzchak Zilberstein Shlita, in his Sefer Shiur the Roifim, takes great issue with this raya from the war. He brings, we don't have time to go into it right now, but it's a fascinating shua from the Chassam Sefer, where he discusses the idea that a king has certain rights. He bases himself on a Ramban, al Torah, and Pashas B'chul Kosai coming up soon, that a king is not allowed to go ahead and just kill people for no reason, but a king has a certain right to appoint people for certain positions, for certain communal obligations. And if they refuse it, then they can be put to death. He has a right also from Sefer Yehoshua, at the beginning of Sefer Yehoshua like that. Just to sum it up quickly, Rabbi Yitzchak Zilberstein says to take this 16% ratio and to plug it into every other situation of sakana will be too vast. You can't do that. For a specific king, for David HaMelech, or the kings of the Chashmonaim, for a kingdom, they have certain rights. But to apply that as the percentage in general for society, he says that would be too extreme. What is a better way to gauge it? So, unfortunately, we're not going to have time to go through number 8, but 8 is a tshuva of Avnei Nezer about Bris Milah. But in number 9, the tshuva from the Minchas Shlomo of Shlomo Zalman Auerbach Zatzal, he really tells us getting down to it, the bottom line, how do we magdir safek pikuach nefesh? He says, Gam anoichi, he writes, I too, be'oni, in my poverty, his tapakti tuva b'zen, is, he's being very humble, he says, but in my, humble knowledge, it's very hard for me to get the exact gather. But he writes, nearly this tight, it appears to me, to kol shederach roif b'nei adam, if it's the way of most of mankind, live roach mizeh, to run away from this situation, at least it'll now become in the gather of a suffix of putting your life in danger. And therefore, Rabbi Zuberstein said, back to the Shiloh we had of someone who's a Magid Shiur. He gives a Daf Yomi Shiur. He's being called out to the Shtachim to come and give a Shiur there. Is he allowed to go or not? So he says he spoke to his father-in-law, Rabbi Yashiv Zatzal, about it. Rabbi Yashiv felt that if people just say they don't travel these roads because they have no reason for it, that's not a reason not to travel the roads for Parnasa. Meaning, you ask me, would I go to Ferguson nowadays? Probably not. Because I have no reason to go, right? But if I had a business and I had to go down to Harlem or to other places where there's a potential risk in Ferguson, if I had a business reason to go, I would go. The reason why I don't go and I think it's dangerous is because I have no reason to go, right? But if people are going there, like we said before from the Middle Stock, the idea that business is as usual, people are going there for a business, people go make deliveries there, then even though there is a certain risk, Rabbi Yashiv said up to 5% he holds is a miyut, is a something which is not shchiach. You don't have to take that into consideration. You're not considered to be ma'abed atzmo l'das. You're not considered to be putting yourself like in a suicidal situation if you're taking a risk of up to 5%. And 5% of a risk of getting yourself in a severely damaged situation. Not talking about tripping and stubbing your toe. That doesn't necessarily mean death. It means to be severely injured. That he says, that's not considered a risk. In a similar shaila, just cut it short for a minute, the stipler was once asked, we know that when a person gets involved in a shidduch for a prospective mate, it halachically is mandated if there's a certain genetic risk for a disease that you're carrying for that you know about, so you have to tell the other side, I just want to let you know that I'm a carrier for X and Y disease, there's a certain amount of risk involved. If you marry me, that our offspring might have this genetic, deformity. So the stipler was asked, a certain girl, her family approached the stipler that she did a blood test and she found out there was a 4% chance that her offspring would have a genetic disorder. Is she required to tell her prospective chassan or not before they get married? She knows a 4% chance that our offspring will have this genetic deficiency. This type said no. Such a far-fetched percentage, something which is the statistics, the statistica, he said in Hebrew, right? The statistics is so far that a 4% chance, and that's something we have to deal with in halachically, and therefore he says that's not something you have to reveal before you enter into prospective shidduch. Just to end off with an idea for the Mesilas Yesharim, I think it'll be very appropriate for now these days during Shiur. We're all working on ourselves. Mesilas Yesharim Perek Tes is talking about the idea of zrizis, acting with a certain level of alacrity, of quickness, to be excited to do the will of Hashem. And he talks about things which cause us to lose our zrizis, things which cause us to be mafsid our zrizis. We don't properly act within a proper attitude towards doing Torah and mitzvahs. And he says many people use for an excuse, they're scared of certain things. He says people are roiv hapachad v'goydel hamayra. There's a great amount of fear in the world, and people are always saying, well, I can't go to shul today because I heard there might be a blizzard. It might snow. It might be slippery outside. I might get stuck in the rain. There might be a security threat. They might lock all the doors in the shul, I'll be locked in. There are all types of things that we often get panicked about, and we use it as an excuse not to properly service Hashem. So the Mesilas Yesharim has a great line. It's towards the bottom of where I copied it. It's maybe like 6-7 lines from the bottom. He says, Da yesh yira v'yesh yira. There's fear and there's fear. Yesh yira ru'uya. There's fear which is appropriate for a Jew. V'yesh yira shaitan. And there is a level of fear which is called the yira of a shaitan, of a fool. Yesh bitacha. There's a certain level of confidence we have to have in Hashem. V'yesh hailus. And there's a certain level of acting in a ridiculous fashion. Kihine, this is a great line from the Mesilas Yesharim. If you're ever looking for haskama, people before they publish a sefer, they often get haskama, a bracha from great rabbanim. Even if you don't publish a sefer, the Mesilas Yesharim is about to give each and every Jew, each and every person a certain level of a haskama, a recognition. He says, Kihine ha'adon baruch hu, the Almighty Hashem, Asas Adam created man, Baal Seichel Nachod, with a certain level of understanding of intellect. We all have Seichel. The Svar Nachayna, each each and every person has a way to balance life properly. To guard his life and to act in a way which is good. And to protect himself from the dangers of life. Why were dangerous things created? They were created to punish the wicked. He says we all have seichel. The problem is, like we always know, the phrase common sense is sometimes not so common. We don't tap into it properly. If we would sit down and do a proper introspection and think things through properly, which is really the Sifsei Chaim on the next page really talks about at great length. I just copied a little bit of it. He says, often we fool ourselves to acting in a certain way because we think we give excuses for it. If we really do a good introspection, really do some good hisboidus, some meditation, think about the course of life that we have chosen and taken, we'll say we're doing X, Y, Z for a certain reason, but really there's 5 other reasons why we're doing it, but we're often afraid to confront the real reason, so we kind of brush it off with their excuses. Well, it's scary. The world's a scary place out there. I just won't go today to shul. I just won't come to the shiur today. I just won't go to do various Torah mitzvahs because I'm afraid of certain things. And Chaim Friedlander there ends off that he's not going to give a specific ratio to this, a specific percentage of what it is and what it's not. But a person has to do a real cheshbon hanefesh to properly balance his life, and we should all be zocheh to approach every aspect of life with the proper yishuv hadas, and we should be zocheh to come up to the yontif now of Kabbalah Torah with the proper way.
Rabbi Kowalski.